This afternoon, I want to try a slightly different format from what we've often followed in this Friday afternoon session. I explained that sometimes I've just simply thrown a piece of meat out and let the tigers go after it. But there doesn't seem to be any of that sort of thing that we can work at today. But what I'd like to do is first we'll ask each speaker, and you can stay and use the microphones at the tables. Each speaker briefly restate for us your theme or the thesis or the main point, or what is it that you would like people to carry home with them from these lectures. And then following that, we'll have a question period. Part A we'll let the speakers ask some questions of each other, and then Part B we'll take questions from the audience, and they can ask of a specific speaker or even all three speakers, if you please. And then the third part, the final part, we'll ask each of the speakers to not exactly sum up, but comment on the theme that we've had here as a whole, that is the three princes of the Reformation, commenting not specifically on the one that has been the focus of your presentation, but what can we say about these three princes and their influence together on the Reformation? So that'll be the last part. So let's start, and we'll go in the order of first lecture and so on. We'll ask each speaker then to briefly restate his theme or thesis or main point.
Okay, how much time do I have?
Oh, a couple of minutes.
A couple of minutes. Yes. Well, you always.
For theologians, that means 5.
Yes. You always have to give a time limit, right? Yes. I mean, I would say, when you look at Frederick the Wise, and it came up in some of the questions yesterday, he seems to be, in one sense, the most diplomat was the word used, or I don't know, somebody who doesn't seem to be the great confessor. And just because, you know, once you write a paper about somebody, you either really hate him or you kind of start liking him. So I kind of start liking him. So I will make a plea for Frederick the Wise to not see him just as pussyfooting around and work with deception and diplomacy. We have to remember that Frederick the Wise was a prince, and as such he was a politician. Right? Now I know that's not a very popular term, and politicians don't have the most highly valued nowadays. But Frederick, when we look at him in hindsight, I think it is easy to think that, to ask yourself the question, why wasn't he bolder? I mean, come on. But of course, in hindsight, we know that the Reformation had a happy outcome. That was not at all clear in 1518, 19, 20, 21, and maybe even later. It was not clear what the outcome was. It was not clear that the Lutheran Reformation would survive. It was not clear that Charles V, for example, was so busy leading his other wars so that he's outside of the country and essentially letting things slide. So the stall and delay tactics, and Frederick was a master in stalling and delaying. It was a political means, but we have to remember he was the politician. He was not Luther. He had a different responsibility. Not only for Luther, he had a responsibility for his country. So that's my plea for to see Frederick the Wise not simply as some kind of a, well, less than honest or honorable person, but as somebody who, in the parameters in which he lived, tried to make the best out of the situation. After all, politics is the art of the possible. Luther had a different vocation. He was not the one who had to care for the entire electorate of Saxony. He had to care for the entire university. He could take the boldness and the stand he did take, and that was his vocation. He had a different vocation, and he acted differently. On the other hand, of course, I don't want to completely whitewash Frederick the Wise. As I pointed out in the paper, in the conflict concerning the All Saints Collegiate Church, there were theological differences. Frederick the Wise did not march as quickly as Luther did in these religious issues. And we see here also that, Luther sends this disclaimer out when he leaves the Wartburg. I don't expect you to protect me. I'll do my thing, and you do your thing. So Luther did not expect the prince to protect him in a way. He never, ever came to him and said, it's your duty that you protect me, which is amazing in a way. It also, of course, shows the boldness of Luther, which we admire so much. Frederick the Wise, again, well, was he a Lutheran? He was a kind of a Lutheran, okay? He obviously saw Luther not just as an asset for his university. He really believed that God was working through Martin Luther. Did he accept everything that Luther was preaching, as we've seen in the issue of the All Saints Collegiate Church? No. So very late, again, we're talking about Christmas 1524, when the liturgical reforms were. Frederick the Wise was not clear that masses for the dead were a problem. But I think, so he didn't think through all the implications, I think, of the reformational breakthrough, of the reformational theology. But I think in the end, again, that he communed under both kinds at his deathbed shows that there was also a confession that he was with Luther.
Okay, thank you. John the Constant or Steadfast, whichever you please.
I was told to speak into the mic. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm going to start out by just saying my training is as a historical theologian. And so when I approach the topic, first of all, I believe there was an implicit theme, or rather thesis, in the very title of the lectures, the cost of confessing. And that implies that these three princes paid a price for their confession of Luther, or of the gospel, as they had been taught and preached to by Luther and the other leaders there in Wittenberg. And so in my paper, I'm trying to put John in his context and show the costs that came to him. And I argue at the beginning of the paper that we have a little bit of trouble with John in that regard. I think he's overshadowed, historically speaking, by the drama of Frederick the Wise and the Luther affair that he had to deal with. And then afterward, although the history really exceeded Luther's time, the defense of Lutheranism by John Frederick and his integrity to maintain what had been established. But the answer to that, I believed, was what did cost John, and where John also shows his vitality to the whole story, in that in the 7 years in particular that John was the elector, after his brother died in May of 1525, it's at that time that John could have gone one of two ways. And it seemed at first that he was going to be quite quiescent and sit back. But as it turned out after the Peasants' War, this was not the case. But that John rose to the occasion and became that vital bridge between the Reformation issues that were raised early on in really, I'd say the Heidelberg Disputation forward. I mean, the theses certainly did spark a revolt, or Reformation, but it's really the Heidelberg theses, I would say, where Luther really starts to stride in Reformation thinking. And it became John's task to take what was there and to, in a sense, institutionalize it. He was the instrument that God used to, in response to the gospel that had won his heart, to move forward to bring the Reformation into the actual institutions of the Saxon church. And for that reason, he paid a price. We saw at Augsburg, which Luther himself memorialized in the funerary sermons that he preached, that John died at Augsburg. The kind of opprobrium he was subject to by Charles because he would not kneel, because he would not do what Charles wanted, took bravery, and John was equal to the task under God at that point. And so while there's not a strong argumentative thesis in the paper, and as a professor, I would grade my paper down for that reason. But the fact is that John shows himself as truly this important link that without which, obviously, God's in control of history, but humanly speaking, we would not have seen the Lutheran Church flower, take root, and be able to withstand then the later pressures that come with the balance of the 16th century.
Good. And John Frederick.
First of all, before my formal presentation this morning, I had wanted to thank our distinguished hosts for the wonderful reception we've been given here at Bethany. It's on, isn't it? Okay. Before my talk this morning, I had intended to thank our really gracious and wonderful hosts here at Bethany College, Bethany Lutheran College and Seminary, for their hospitality to us. This has been a wonderful event, and I'm very grateful to have been a part of it. So thank you to our hosts. I did have a couple of theses to the paper. And roughly speaking, they were the fact that theology was first and foremost and last for at least John Frederick, and probably in their own way, certainly for John the Constant, but in his own way for Frederick the Wise as well. Theology and not princes or politics drove the Reformation movement. This was an evangelical theology, one centered in the gospel. This particular kind of theology informed and drove the partnership of Luther and John Frederick, and this was consistent throughout their time together and their careers together. The second thesis, this was a theology cultivated and propelled by intellectual, rigorous, disciplined academic work, by university education. And that university education, in turn, was informed by the central disciplines of Renaissance humanism, and most specifically, the languages and rhetoric. And finally, I don't know if I stated this as a third thesis, but the gospel informed and permeated all of the mature Luther's theological expression. And I'm using, you could define mature Luther from any a number of starting points. I'm just taking it for the time that they served together, the time of John Frederick's electorship from 1532 on. And that gospel informed and permeated all of Luther's theological work in terms of content, in terms of method, and in terms of function. One of the things that I came to appreciate about John Frederick in a way that I hadn't before. I admit that as a seminary student and even an instructor, I had an awareness of what John Frederick did at highlight moments, small called, and after after Luther's death and that cluster of events from 1546 to 1552. But one of the things that I was struck in learning more and unfolding some of this, John Frederick was there from the very beginning. He was in the thick of things from the beginning. And for me, the high point is what he did and what he refused to do after 1546. Yes, it would have been a capitulation, but one can understand how he could have agreed to the Augsburg interim to secure his release from prison. Others did those kinds of things, and how different the subsequent events would have been had he been a little less resolute in those years. I think subsequent history looks back upon him very favorably and positively for his work in those years.
Okay, thank you. Now, for the next round, starting with the first lecturer, do you have any questions you'd like to address to either or both?
I have a question for Dr. Lump. You mentioned on the councils and the church as one of the major writings, and of course the small cult articles also deal with the question of the council. And it's an interesting point that at that time you still have the question, would a council be helpful? On the other hand, of course, I mean, Luther already at the Leipzig Disputation, 1519, asserts that council can be mistaken, which really kind of breaks the mold of medieval ecclesiology and also leaves the question open, how do we decide theological conflict? Because there is no final institution in a way. How would you say then, I mean, these overtures about council, first of all, historically, did anybody actually hope for church unity? And what's your evaluation how Luther thinks that theological dispute has to be resolved then?
I think Luther's statements about his desire to attend a free and open and scripture-bound, Word of God-bound council, by this, he was a realist too, and by this point, and he said as much, by this time, I don't think he anticipated any real likelihood of that transpiring. But the kind of council he envisioned would be one that there would have to be a prior commitment that all the sides involved would be normed by the Word of God. And I didn't go back and check this, but only a handful of those early councils did he give that kind of affirmation to, namely that these were councils that were conducted in a positive and constructive way. So that's what
Anything to add to that, Dr.
Well, it's hard to speculate what Luther would or wouldn't do, especially as we move later into his life with regard to it. But I think he would always have been willing. I think it was somewhat implicit in your paper that while he doubted a council's ability to settle anything, he would have seen value to go to confess. And I think you see that more and more in Luther. I mentioned in my paper, he went to Marburg not because he was convinced that this was a good thing or a constructive thing rather to do, in the sense that it's going to create some kind of unity or win the Swiss over or anything of this, bring clarity on the sacrament with the sacramentarian controversy. But it was an important thing to do to confess the truth, and he would have allowed for a council if it would have allowed him to truly go and speak. He intended to do that at Worms, for that matter, and was stifled, which then led to his first, moments of panic there, and then to come back the next day and to boldly affirm his stance on the Word of God. So I would just add that as maybe something to consider in regard.
Okay, a question from Dr. Law.
I'll pass.
Okay, Dr. Courtwright.
This is not a dramatic pause. This is me trying to gather my thoughts.
Oh, go for the drama.
This is, I was saying to Dr. Lump earlier, I really appreciate his paper for the analysis. I thought that there's a lot of things here that are raised, not so much for the sake of saying Luther says this or Luther teaches that, but raising these issues is important to us as confessional Lutherans. And one of those is the whole matter that we've discovered, I think, over the course of mission work in the 20th century, that we've arrived back to a point that early Lutherans come to this country realize, and that is the necessity of establishing theological education as the key to real mission work wherever we go. And in the modern Lutheran world, where we're trying to work in cultures and so forth, I think we've reaffirmed that, at least the Lutherans I'm familiar with. And that's an important thing that we see happening with the three princes, but I think we'd have to give the nod beyond the establishment of the university to John Frederick for really putting the university not just on a financial footing, but putting the university onto a solid Lutheran footing. And I don't know if there are questions or discussion the group would want to have, that we're starting to realize that the name of the game is theological education as far as real outreach and sustaining, another word that we overuse today, like a couple other words that were used, but sustaining mission work in the world. So I make that as a comment, I guess, and see if it goes anywhere as far as maybe interest of the group or the other reactors.
Anybody want to pick that one up?
I would affirm that. I mean, again, the point is to see that Luther is sustained in a way, at least on a sociological level, so to speak, by the institution of the university. That gives him the freedom to develop his theology. That gives him also the opportunity to win allies. It would have been very different if Luther had served, would just have lived in a monastery and maybe had written something. So these institutions are important. On the other hand, of course, well, Wittenberg would have been much more different if there was no Luther. So there are two kind of fallacies. The one is the kind of the great man fallacy. It's all the great man, period. Well, there are always people around him. There are institutions that enable him to do what he does. The other would be that you have kind of a sociological fallacy. Well, the great man is just kind of, it's the really institutions that do everything. I mean, the marvelous thing about the Reformation was that you had that confluence. There was Luther, there was the university in Wittenberg, there was Melanchthon at the right time, and there were the princes that supported Luther in that. If you take one of these things away, again, this is all purely speculative, but the Reformation as we know it would not have happened. Now, theologically, of course, we know that it's the Word of God that does everything. But the Word of God uses these human institutions. That's, after all, what when we confess that, the government is a divinely established estate, and also the spiritual estate and the family. They work together at best, not only to uphold order, but also to foster the preaching of the Word. We live in a very different time, so that it's difficult to simply translate that or to draw direct lessons from that.
Any further? Yeah.
And yet I will hazard one. We are, it's no surprise, it's no secret, we are living in a time, and I mean a very specific time prior to a national election, where Christians are being asked to make some decisions about the future. I'm not promoting one or the other of our national candidates, but the ramifications for Christianity at the present time in the United States, the future of Christian education, such as this institution and the seminary attached to it, and other confessional colleges and seminaries, is something we need to take very, very seriously. And I think that the subjects of the three princes and their support and their example in this regard is very helpful in underscoring that this is important, what we are doing in these places, and that's worthy of our support, moral, certainly, but also financial, prayer, and so forth. And hearing a historical topic like this might say, well, that was interesting. But there is something to take from this in terms of where you are individually and what you're going to be doing with time, talent, and treasure towards the ongoing training of Christians, and especially also those called to the ministry. So it is a pertinent topic and one of application, I think, not just historic interest. I'm not accusing my colleague that he was saying that.
Dr. Lump.
Thank you. One observation that I would add with the University of Wittenberg and the embrace of humanism, you had a different mode of theological expression. Luther writes aside from the substantive doctrinal differences, Luther writes differently, a different style, a different mode than Thomas Aquinas. That reflects their differing intellectual backgrounds and their education, and probably also their disposition. But the additional point that I would make is when we talk about education, and I'm coming out of some years in a mid-level administrative capacity at Concordia, just how important curricular decisions are and how much import and meaning they have. These things sometimes tend to get reduced to horse trading about credit hours and this and that, when in fact curricular questions, curricular decisions are a response to a question of what kind of minds and hearts do we want to inform and, God willing, shape as much as we can. And curriculum it's not the be-all and end-all, but it goes a significant way to addressing those kinds of questions. So that's a little bit of a plea to keep the theological and the formational question primary.
Okay, now let's turn to the audience, and to begin this, I was handed a question written out, and and the request was that I should read it, so I will. Somewhere I read the view expressed that the involvement of the prince in the visitation was very significant, virtually a passing of the point of no return, I suppose it meant, on the road to loss of the true church, church-state separation in early Lutheranism. Do you agree with this assessment? Who wants to go with that first?
I'll jump in. As I hear the question, my mind immediately goes to a comment that was told me yesterday, and I would certainly second it very, very much. That kind of assessment is so dependent upon the context that the three princes find themselves in, and cannot be made into a principle and brought forward to apply in some direct and easily seen way in a modern situation. What Luther used, and the calling, if you will, the vocation of the Christian prince under the extraordinary situation of the 16th century that John the Constant found himself in, necessitated that he become the Notbischof, that he would use his princely authority, his Christian calling, to further the gospel and protect it under his calling in the context in which he found himself. That later, in the founding of this country, it was seen to be the evils, if you will, of the state church, and of really not so much the state church, but the federal government's maintenance of a particular religion was seen to be counter to what our founders saw as necessary to safeguard the freedoms of the future United States over against what they had seen develop in Europe. So it's a completely different context that they have to address. We would not prefer, I'm sure, anything like the state church system among us, but I don't think I would try to assess the role of either John or John Frederick in particular as being the start of some evil. If you want to do that, you'd have to go back to Constantine and say that he's really the author of all this, and some people want to do that. I would just argue for context as far as making those kinds of assessments. It may remind us of the situation that we face or that we are in, but it's not the same thing.
The concept of the separation of church and state, that's of course, what do you mean by that? Not even in the United States you have a strict separation of church and state. I mean, the Senate has a chaplain, or is it the Congress? I mean, again, I'm a foreigner, so excuse if I make any mistakes here. You have chaplains that are paid by the government. I know that the ELS and WELS don't participate in that, but nevertheless, the government does pay clergy to minister in these situations. And I suppose a strict separation of church and state would be as impossible as a separation of state and economics. There's always an overlap there. The modern form of that you don't have state churches functions in an environment where you have a civil society, where you have the freedom of association, for example, where you have this kind of a civil society that was just not there in the 16th century. In the 16th century, the option was not a free church or state church. The option was chaos or somebody has to step in. The princes stepped in. They did help in organizing and also overseeing the Lutheran Church. That was a good thing at that time. Now, that system has its problems, and it developed, it showed itself, of course, later on when the princes were not first led by theology, as Dr. Lum pointed out, but when they became essentially secular rulers that saw the church as a fabulous thing that helped them to discipline their subjects. Then it really became a problem. The state church system worked pretty well in Europe, I'd say, until the breakdown of Lutheran orthodoxy, when then the princes did not make the decision to support the truth, but support external peace and hold the things together with the kind of the modern concept of a people's church. So for us, that's not a way to go. It's not even an option. The other question is, our system has certainly its benefits, and we are thankful for that. We could at least ask the question, has it only benefits? In a modern society, Christianity or the truth is a choice among others. We are all participants on the religious marketplace. And lo and behold, what does the pastor become? Some kind of a salesman. Religion is a private choice. Religion is pushed out of the realm of truth into the realm of personal opinion. These are some of the consequences that our system has, which are not that great, actually. Again, I have no lust for, well, I mean, sometimes I do, okay. When, maybe you heard that quite recently Queen Margaret of Denmark came to Wittenberg and gave a red parament. That's kind of it doesn't mean much, but it's kind of a nice symbol, right? You have a queen there and she demonstrates her adherence to some form of Lutheranism, let's put it carefully. But of course, that's folklore. That is not. Our situation is different. We have to combat different things. We have to combat this idea that religion is simply a private choice, that that again the pastor is the salesperson, that members of a congregation are consumers, for example. So I'd be careful to simply paint or say that, oh, this was all evil. Now we live in a much better environment. They had their problems, and not everything of that system was good. We have different problems in our setting.
One thing that suggests itself to me from the question, I suppose, is wonder what would Luther and perhaps at least the second two princes have said if they heard James Madison credit Luther for the idea of separation of church and state. What would any of them say to that?
Okay, again, as
Have him arrested.
Luther did not believe that a community that is religiously pluralistic could survive. And I'm not defending that again, but Luther's advice was, for example, if you're in an imperial city, one of those city-states, and the Lutherans are in the minority, it's probably the best thing that you leave. Because otherwise this will end in some form of civil unrest, strife, whatsoever. Luther could not envision that a community was not also religiously united. By now we know that this is possible. In that sense, the United States and all modern states are a disproof of that thesis of Luther. But there he was. I mean, he could not envision that. So there's an affinity to that. Again, because Luther was not a theocrat, did not have any theocratic ideas. That's why Lutherans can very comfortably live in a modern society without lusting for the power of the government. But it's not the only way how Lutherans can live.
Just to add to that a little bit, certainly Luther was not naive, or at least his naivete disappeared as time went on. He became quite realistic about the dear Wittenbergers, to the point that he walked out of the pulpit and said, I would rather preach to dogs than you, because you so dishonor the word of God. But at the same time, he wouldn't have said, well, you form your church and I'll have mine, something like that. It just was beyond the realm of the thinkable at his time. So he saw that there were certainly, the unbelievers or the callous hearts out there, but he would never have said, well, the solution to that is to create, the church of the unchurched, and we'll have the church of the real one over here. And so he enlisted the need for the state to visit and to promote Christian learning and to promote the kind of uniformity, not lockstep, but certainly the uniformity that allowed the gospel to do its work on those hearts.
Dr. Luff, anything?
First of all, I appreciate both Dr. Ziegler and Dr. Kortwright's comments. I would add that I think Luther, again, trying to avoid the what would Luther do kinds of questions, but it does provide an opportunity. The current pluralistic context does provide an opportunity for reminding us all that to conduct our various Christian vocations within this current context, and for lack of a better expression, getting things done will take place differently in our present context when our weapons, if you will, are persuasion, friendship, prayer, than they would have in the kind of socio-political climate in which Luther himself functioned. But this, what do we do now? We exercise our vocations as conscientiously and constructively and as positively as we can.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Now we'll go to audience mic.
Peter Harsted from Lakeville, Minnesota. I have a question about these early curriculum reformers. To what extent and when did they really know where this might be leading?
they knew that without the languages, pastors couldn't read the Word of God. And without the ability to read the Word of God, theology, evangelical gospel theology, was not going to perhaps even survive, much less thrive. They knew that certain things were indispensable for the kind of pastors and people and theologians they needed to produce.
I don't think Luther was very reticent at all in wanting to move forward without, rather being quite sure of the direction things needed to go. Arriving at the University of Wittenberg, once he was on the ground, he began to not foment, but certainly urge that Aristotle be dethroned. And this was early on. It was one of the things that he was trying to do from almost the get-go, because of exactly what was just said, the need to get the Word of God unhindered into the hands of the future pastors and teachers of the area. So he was very convinced quite early on that this was the necessary program that needed to be followed, and that was before he wrote the 95 Theses or any of the things that followed after 1517, 1518.
It is interesting. You have the early reforms in 1518, and then you have the later ones that Dr. Lump spoke about, where you actually see that they kind of revise certain things. Not the fundamentals, the primacy of languages, biblical study, but with the reintroduction of disputations, for example, and the reintroduction of the doctoral degree, in one of maybe it is the first disputation, Luther makes the point that our preachers have to be able not only to preach the truth, but also to argue for it and to refute the opponents. So there you have a kind of they saw that logic has its place, that the disputations that were abolished because they had degenerated in medieval times to just kind of, mental jousting and on ludicrous questions, that there is a place for that. So they did learn in a way. So like any good institution, right? So you institute a curriculum revision, and then after a few years you look at it, evaluate it, and see, okay, yes, we get them to that point, but there are certain deficiencies of it. So we have to reinstitute that. So this is a learning process in a way, because again, it is a radical revision. It's a radical revision of the medieval system, and a system that then continued again pretty much the same till the end of the old universities, which in Germany was around 1800, and then you have the new model university with the reforms of Wilhelm von Humboldt, which is really our modern university, which is a research university. In one sense, of course, the old university is not about research, that is, let's generate knowledge. It is about giving knowledge to the students. The knowledge is already there.
Okay, back.
Tom Custer from Bethany College and Seminary. A bit more about that, which gets to a question that you and we as experienced educators perhaps still wrestle with. Aristotle keeps coming up, and we know that Luther, as you say, was very tough on Aristotle as early as 1518 in the philosophical theses he defended at Heidelberg. And yet we see Melanchthon, for example, authored a textbook on rhetoric which drew, I think, heavily from Aristotle. Is there something we can learn from these men about how they managed intellectual resources from non-Christian, indeed pagan sources, something that we still struggle with perhaps today? What is the razor by which we separate what is useful from what is perverse?
Who would like to take that one? Dr. Lump.
briefly and maybe too casually, the rule of thumb has been Aristotle and some of his writings are useful when they deal with, for lack of a better designation, horizontal matters. When they begin to get into vertical, God, human being matters, then one has to look elsewhere, specifically to the Word of God. Luther's point is, in some of those early, the disputation against scholastic theology, Aristotle's not going to help you be a better person. You're not going to use Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics to help you be a better person. You need to know what it says, but St. Paul will help you be a better person. And I think the sort of rule of thumb is when you're dealing with tools and categories and horizontal kinds of considerations, Aristotle and people like that, Cicero and the like, are useful. When they start talking about how a person ought to live, how a person ought to think, how a society ought to be structured or governed, then you're into more challenging and difficult territory, and you have to look elsewhere.
Jeffrey Kenning, a pastor in southwest Iowa. A question for any or all of them, but to follow on a comment by Dr. Ziegler. You talked about the confluence of many things, the genius of Luther, the genius or near genius of Melanchthon, humanism, the rise of the institution, these princes. I find it remarkable that you have three princes in a row that are very pious, devout men, that were all very interested in things theological. Confess my ignorance, before and after this time, were the men before and after them also of that, or is this unusual that you have these three princes that are all devout, pious men?
We all talk at once.
Okay. Well, I can't speak authoritatively about the House of Bethany going far back, and nor would I try to talk, get up into the 1700s and be able to talk about European history and the leaders there. What's unusual about the three you've hit on, and that is that they were captive to the Word of God. And I would include Frederick certainly in that. And furthermore, especially as Luther himself came to be, to enunciate the gospel clearly and preach it clearly, that they became captive to that. And so you do have something unusual in them. However, certainly in their own way and in accord with their own piety, I wouldn't doubt that you could go back and find pious rulers who did what the church said they should do and understood that they were doing what was inside them that the church said they should do. Even Frederick, establishing the immense relic collection that he did before he comes to know the gospel, of course he maintained it throughout his life, nonetheless did so because he was a pious man. And God bless us with pious leaders all the time, but these three, under God's guidance and God's grace, were not just adjunct, but certainly part and parcel with the success looking back at the Reformation. And so I think they are unusual in terms of what they did say and confess, but at the same time, you could find other examples of, Charles V, to a certain extent, is a pious man. He's a pious Catholic. We would certainly criticize him, and his personal life is also something we could also examine, but the point is that he believed he was acting according to his faith.
I think when you go on, you can see that there were quite a few members of the House of Bethany that were pious. I mean, you had Henry the Pious, the successor to George the Bearded, who introduced the Reformation. That's, of course, the Albertine line. And going down that route, the Elector August, who was a little bit naive about some of the things that were going on in Wittenberg, but once he found out, he certainly helped to restore the University of Wittenberg, for example, to its Lutheran character. And we're talking at lunch, Johann Georg, who was kind of Well, he liked his drink a little bit too much, but personally was a pious person. With that, we are in the 17th century. On the other side, on the house of the Ernestine house, in the 17th century, you have Duke Ernest the Pious, for example, who was the first one to introduce general schooling, and, for example, also lives on as the inspirer of the so-called Weimarer Bibelwerk, which is a kind of a Lutheran study Bible, which weighs about 15 pounds, where he asked the foremost scholars of his time, among others Johann Gerhard, to provide this kind of a resource, mostly probably for pastors, which, by the way, was reprinted in the United States, edited by Karl Ferdinand Wilhelm Walter. So sometimes you probably might, I don't know if it still appears, and by the way, it was reprinted in Germany at the end of the 20th century. So there's a whole number of pious princes. It would be an interesting question when that kind of ended, and my guess is, I have not researched that, but my guess is really you have that tectonic shift, a cultural shift, broadly speaking about the Enlightenment, that secularized the view of government, that secularized also the princes. So when you come to the 18th century, it's much more dim. I mean, even in Saxony, then you have August the Strong. I mean, traditionally, the elector of Saxony was kind of the primary leader of Lutheranism. What does August do? Not only that he has a thoroughly immoral private life, but in order to become king of Poland, he converts, or well, I wouldn't say converts, so he changes to Roman Catholicism. So that's kind of, it went well for a while, but there you already have then the shift where power politics becomes everything. And theology no longer dominates also the princes.
Once for one of my classes to put the Reformation in context, I was looking for a list of the rulers of Saxony, and sure enough, Wikipedia had a table with pictures of each one, and not enough biographical information to give you much of an idea about their piety, but a little bit of an indication. And it really is quite a long list. So if anybody's interested at least in seeing what these fellows looked like, maybe. Okay, another, let's see, what was
Just
that?
one comment on that.
Yep.
Even before August the Strong decides that Poland was worth a mass, you know, John George II already almost has a certain unionistic vibe to him in a certain sense. You have kind of the middle of the syncretistic controversy, you have kind of a, you know, the John George I was defending the Leipzig and Wittenberg faculty, and they did some naughty things along the way there, granted. But John George II was kind of more open to having more and more Catholics serve there. He gets in trouble with his populace. They make him promise, you know, not to bring so many Roman Catholics in. So it seems right around with John George II, after about 1650, that's that kind of line where we start to fade a little bit.
Thank you.
Yes, Chaplain Don Molstead from here at Bethany. Thank you, gentlemen, for the excellent papers. Very good. Just a general question maybe for each one of you regarding the individuals you studied. Did any of your preconceived notions change? And, or maybe another way to ask it is, are there preconceived notions that you think are generally held about these individuals in Lutheranism that need to be altered?
Okay, on that one, let's go from the third to the second to the first.
Okay.
I'm not sure if it's a preconceived notion, but I have a much greater appreciation for, and I guess I could say I envied this. John Frederick was essentially there with his godfather, Frederick the Wise, and his father from the very beginning. And the fact that he was present throughout is something that I did find extraordinary and simply enviable.
John the Constant, other AKA Charles Courtney.
I specifically start the paper by saying that John is the forgotten one, or he's this more minor. He's the Isaac of the trio, and maybe I'm making a confession there of how I approached him. Initially, that, all the drama is there in Frederick the Wise. And if you're a student of Luther's biography, which I really enjoy Luther's biography, so my attention has been focused on the first part of the 16th century. It is Frederick the Wise who stands out because it's just this is the dramatic part of Luther's trials. And then the later material with John Frederick, he has to face the emperor's wrath finally after the battle of the Schmalkaldic League. So these two just kind of stood out in my mind, and I said, well, where's John the Constant in all this? And so my mind has changed quite a bit, obviously, in regard to that. So I answered my own characterization. I think we would have the wrong perception of him if we just saw him as some kind of bridge or an Isaac. And that's not fair to Isaac either, by the way, is it? So, but this quiet, confessing prince, in relative terms to the drama that we see in the early 16th century, changed pretty radically, I would say, in that regard. Just that I realized just how much John counted.
Frederick the Wise, I think I learned to appreciate him more, warts and all. Was he a hero? Depends how you define a hero. He was a man who, I think, definitely has, of course, its place in Reformation history because he's part of that dramatic early days of Luther. You realize also that, if you think of it, the whole thing, the Reformation affair, so to speak, was about 7 years of his life. Now, for those of you who are students, 7 years is a half an eternity, but once you march along in time, 7 years is not that long. So and certainly at that time, Frederick the Wise was an older man. For an older man to change drastically, that doesn't happen very often. Once you get over your midlife crisis, right, then that's it. So in that sense also, you could say psychologically or biographically, you have to give him credit. You have to see, again, I think it was maybe easier for the younger members of the House of Bethany. He went along, and I appreciate him for that. He had his weaknesses. He didn't quite see things clearly. But, if you pass to some ministerial students, also, when you go to a congregation and you try to convince somebody of something, that takes time. So who knows what would have happened if Frederick the Wise had lived another 10 years.
Back here.
Hi, Matthew Tessmer, Martin Luther College. As we look at education and curricular reform, I want to see if we can expound a little more on the role of the library at Wittenberg and where those materials came from, what materials were added to it when we saw the reform, and where is that collection still together today, and if it is, where is that?
Wish Bob Kolb was here.
Yes.
You want to start on that?
No.
Oh.
I think David.
The short answer is I don't know. The bibliographic answer that I can provide, the Schwiebert volume goes into great length on the whole destiny of the library, how some of the specifics about what got put into it, what emphases came to the fore. So that's the place that I would look, and my hunch is Bethany has that volume in its library. The German title that is cited in a handful of the footnotes in my paper, there are a couple of chapters with really helpful information there as well. But in terms of the specifics of where its disposition and all of that, that off the top of my head I can't do.
You're referring to Luther in His Times, that volume?
No.
This is E.G. Ernst G. Schwiebert.
Yeah. To save a little time, it's published by Fortress. I believe it's the Reformation, a university movement or something. It's 2 volumes in one, and it's about 2 inches thick, and it's just a mass of information. Again, not always stated in the most sprightly prose, but I think Professor Schwiebert published that book, I don't know, in his 80s or 90s. He lectured at Concordia Seminary when I was a student there, and he was very, very old then.
So this would have come after Luther in his times.
Yeah, oh yes, yeah, decades after. But there's lots and lots of material there.
It's in the seminary library.
Thank you.
Just a quick note, too. I forget the library that went on fire not that long ago, a German library, but,
That was
there's-
Weimar.
yeah,
Weimar.
so very, very little of these libraries have withstood the fires of time. The Herzog August is about the only one I could name off the top of my head, and that isn't stuff that would have been from the actual 16th century necessarily. So the idea that much of the original books and so forth have somehow survived, they were subject to war, subject to fires, and who knows where anything else is. Vatican Library, maybe.
That's Heidelberg. That's
Well, if the library was moved once, it was probably moved more than once.
could be.
Ted Gullickson, a retired pastor living in Mankato. I'm wondering, perhaps John Steadfast should be credited for his vocation of raising his son to be so pious, and I don't know how much information there is in that. I'd like to change subject to part of your 3 papers having to do with politics. That is, Luther seems to be in a transition between the feudal system of government and the divine right of kings system that came later through Henry VIII and the French kings. And I'm not sure Luther would subscribe to the divine right, but he certainly subscribed to the 3 estates as divine institutions. And my question is, how did Luther impact that transition between feudal and another system of statecraft? And did he influence it, or did that come through Enlightenment or some other way?
Well, my impression, to jump in real quickly here, is that you would put Luther well towards the end of that process of change. I mean, the rise of the cities and the decline of feudalism was well underway before Luther was born. And in Luther's time, of course, we see the knights, von Sickingen and the knights trying to hold on to what little influence they still had, and they disappear. Luther would not put his trust in them. So I guess I'm wondering, maybe someone can correct me, that it seems that the process you're indicating was really, he's at the tail end of rather than being in the middle of for the most part.
I think what is maybe even more important is the kind of a change from a view that the government or that the state is essentially a property of the prince. I mean, the Leipzig division is an example for that. It's unthinkable for us nowadays that princes treat their territory just like an inheritance. And what with the emergence, and I mentioned it shortly in my just a note in my paper, the emergence of the modern bureaucratic state is happening in that time. And going back to the question about church and state and all these things, bureaucracies also they are anonymous in a way, and they look for efficiency. If you have the personal regiment of a prince, not again to say this is the right thing, but if you have the personal regiment of the prince, of course, when the prince is driven by theology, the whole state is driven by theology. If you think about it, how we live today, it's the bureaucracies that drive everything. I mean, whomever you elect, right? They can't completely change how things run, because there's this huge government machine that runs according to its own laws, okay? And maybe that was also part of the secularization that we see then later on, that the moment you have a different kind of view of state and how states are run, then this bureaucratic understanding that talks about efficiency, rationality, that is essentially kind of religious neutral takes over. And then, of course, state churchism becomes a real problem.
Anything to add? Okay. Let's see, we're over here.
Michael Albrecht from St. Paul. I'm fascinated by Luther at Worms from the standpoint of this being the only time that he and Frederick were actually together in the same room. And I think about this in terms of my own reactions. If you read a book and you've never met the author, you have ideas about what that person might be like, and then you meet them and you discover something different. Or you hear somebody on the radio day after day and you think you know what they must look like, and then you actually see them. It makes a big difference to actually see each other face to face, I think. And I like to think that's not just a modern phenomenon. And so what I'm wondering is, how much did that face-to-face meeting influence how they thought about each other ever after, especially since it was the only one? And it seems to me that part of that is that at Worms, you said Frederick was an old man. Well, 58. Luther, 37. Hadn't quite had his 38th birthday yet that year. And now let's throw in Charles V, 21. Now, who's supposed to have all the power in this room? The young 21-year-old. And not only is this the only time that Luther and Frederick would actually see each other, I think it's safe to say it's the only time that Luther and Charles ever saw each other too. And now, we could speculate about how that might have affected things, but I'm wondering, is there any way we can document something about impressions that Charles got of Luther, or impressions that Frederick got of Luther, or that Luther got of them? I mean, I'm thinking about, we do have an account from the Heidelberg Disputation, physical description of Luther and how piercing his eyes were and how you could practically see his bones. He was so thin and things like that. I mean, he made a lasting impression in 1518 on people who saw him there. Now, is something like that going on in 1521 at Worms?
I am not aware of it. I'm not aware that Frederick commented in any way on that. And honestly, I also don't know if Luther, that was something I had to look up, that Luther in any way commented about seeing his prints. But again, there are comments about, of course, recollections later on regarding, I think, how his encounter with Charles V. I'm hazy on the content right now. But to reinforce your point, it is kind of odd. I mean, by now, you all know why, but wasn't Frederick ever curious to hear Luther preach? No. Obviously, statecraft superseded his curiosity.
I was just going to point I think it's Schwiebert who discusses Luther's eyes, yeah. And it's either Aleander, yeah. Or
Cayetan.
Yeah, Cayetan, who makes the comment that his eyes were beastly. There's a mad beast raging behind them. So those eyes were obviously striking, but you also came to how they struck you with preconceived notions, it sounds like.
Yeah, I'm sure.
You know, by the way, in one of the lectures, did you refer to the first biography of Luther? Who?
Spalatin.
Now, how about Cocleus? He's sometimes referred, Cocleus, writing from a Catholic point of view, and probably a little bit on the scurrilous side, is sometimes credited with being the first, and I think that would have had to have been before Spalatin, is that right?
As a biography of Frederick?
No, of Luther.
No, I was referring to Spalatin,
Oh,
wrote
I
the
see.
first
Okay.
biography of Frederick the Wise. Well, actually the only one.
Yeah. But you've heard about, or Cocleus
Yes.
being credited as the first biography of Luther.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, let's see, is there another one here? Okay, maybe it's time to ask the speakers, and again, going in turn from Frederick the Wise, to summarize, again, not too long, but summarize the lectures as a whole, or what can we say about the three princes? Now, we've touched on all of this, I think, going along, but what can we say about all three of these princes and their general influence on the Reformation and on us? So starting with Frederick.
Dr. Lamp made the point that this was not some kind of Prinzenreformation or Fürstenreformation, that the princes did not drive the Reformation. And I think that's an important point, that the princes were driven by theology. That's important because, against defamations of the Reformation as just some kind of a political ploy. I mean, if you want to go for Reformation and political ploys, go to England. It also shows now when you emphasize the influence of the princes for the institutional side of the Reformation, that's undeniable. That's often been interpreted as the social weakness of Lutheranism. I mean, Ernst Troeltsch, that's his thesis, that Lutheranism was kind of passive. This was one of the reasons why Germany remained backward. The modern institutions and modernity was not invented in Germany. It was invented in the Calvinist countries, in the Netherlands, and also in England. I think we don't have to look very far to refute such a thing. Lutheranism Lutheranism was, of course, dependent on the help of the princes, but that does not make Lutherans into some kind of passive bunch. The story of Lutherans in America shows that in different situations, Lutherans were just as able as anybody to found institutions. I mean, again, it's like St. Paul's, right? If you want a monument for the Lutherans, look around. Lutherans were able to create their own and sustain their own institutions, and that is also as I said at the end of my presentation, I think, we give thanks for those before us who exercised their vocation in such a way that it benefited the proclamation of the gospel, and we take heart in our vocation that now, of course, we all wear multiple hats. Sorry.
Heads too.
Well, I hope you don't do that in the science laboratory here. We wear multiple hats. I mean, we belong to all three estates, and therefore we all have a responsibility that at Luther's times was principally and primarily the responsibility of the princes. So if we think of what it means to live in the political estate, for example, we look at these princes and we see our responsibility also towards, as it was mentioned before, towards the maintenance of these institutions. Again, we cannot hope for any great princes that do that. And we are thankful for all those who shouldered that responsibility in the past and shoulder it now, and in that sense are successors to those princes of the House of Wettin.
I would always caution when I taught my courses at WLC that had to do with Reformation history, that Lutherans needed, of course, to beware of the very gross simplification that in the beginning there were the apostles, and then things got really, 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 really bad, and then Luther came in on a white horse, discovered the gospel, and it's been good ever since. Obviously, that kind of, that's an obvious way over exaggeration, but we're properly cautioned against Lutheran triumphalism. I think, Pastor Tigan, you have something about that. And we want to be careful here that we wouldn't lionize Luther himself or the princes as being, these shining knights in armor, clothed either with the word or with real armor. But they were in many ways. And I think what it does for us, looking at these men and their work, it helps us to realistically and yet wholeheartedly celebrate coming Reformation festival year with great thanks to God for his control of history, that he guided history in such a way that we saw this unusual trio of princes who stood somewhat in the background, certainly in regard to Luther and his work, and yet facilitated it with by the grace of God and to the glory of God. And that's an amazing story to keep in mind, and a heartening one to begin a Reformation year as we celebrate 500 years of the nailing of the 95 Theses and the beginning of the Lutheran Reformation. So, with due caution against the kind of hagiographies that would make these men perfect and all of that kind of thing, and we've done that here, I believe. We can properly also come away saying, thank God that he gave us Frederick and John Frederick to be at Luther's side, and gave us Luther for that matter. And yeah, warts and all, but God's grace works through and with sinners and for sinners.
And John Frederick.
Again, I would echo what my colleague said. The word providential for me is appropriate. The division between Ernestine and Albertine Saxony begins in 1485, and the Ernestine side of electors of Saxony pretty much almost perfectly coincides with Luther's life. These are the only three electors under whom Martin Luther served. They provided the institutional context within which the Reformation had a chance to begin, the opportunity to grow and prosper, to acquire some structure and stability, and above all three of them were there to support Luther and Melanchthon and the others as they bore witness to the gospel, which was what the Reformation was then and is now about. So I think, in that setting, I think it is safe to say that these were three providential gifts of God to the church at that time, for which we can all give thanks.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. These lectures are every year printed in the Lutheran Synod Quarterly, the theological periodical put out by our seminary. After the lecturers have had an opportunity to make additions, corrections, deletions if they want, then we edit them here again. And so that means that by the time we're done, I've read each one of these about 4 times, and that's a real blessing to have. Over the last couple of weeks, I got to know 2 of these men who I had not met before, just simply by reading their work. And then one of them, Dr. Courtwright, I think we go back about almost 30 years. Can you believe it's that long? You were still out west. Anyway, and so that was getting to know an old friend. And now I've got 3 young friends. Anyway, look for, or if you don't subscribe to the Lutheran Synod Quarterly, all you have to do is write to Bethany Lutheran Theological Seminary, and they'll tell you how you can subscribe. Now, as we were planning this series of lectures, we're always about a year ahead of each of ourselves, I don't think that it occurred to me that we were putting something together that hadn't really ever been put together before. I can't remember at what point, but at some point I started digging around on the internet and in the libraries to see if I could find any single text book that had all three of these princes enclosed between two covers. And I have not been able to find one. Now, and I checked for German and for English. Who knows, there might be somebody in Czech Republic who's done it, but that's beyond my pale. So anyway, this set of lectures does present something that's unique, and so you can and should look forward to having them in a final form in the Lutheran Synod Quarterly. And I'm thinking a little bit farther ahead than that, and I would like to see them published even in another form as a particular collection, a single book in celebration of the Reformation anniversary. So that's that. Now, we always announce what is probably going to be the lecture subject next year. And again, we weren't thinking maybe in terms of the symmetry here, but it turns out that our plans for next year are a study of Luther's three treatises. Now, these are the three treatises that were written in 1521. Do any of them go into 22? Mostly 1521. They weren't published originally together, but we know them from a little booklet in which they're put together. The first one is Luther's Letter to the Christian Nobility, which has been referred to. The second one in that volume, these are all in Luther's Works, the American edition as well, and also the Holman edition. The second one is Luther's Critique of the Roman Catholic Sacramental System, the Babylonian Captivity of the Church. And the third one is The Freedom of the Christian. And that's the one where Luther's famous paradox is thrown out. The Christian is a perfectly free Lord and also a bound servant to the Lord, or perfectly free. Well, I'm not going to try and do that. Anyway, I always trip my tongue over that one. Anyway, that's the subject for next year, and I think that we look forward to being enlightened on that one too. Then, was there anything else that? No, I think that that's everything I was supposed to. Am I supposed to do anything else, boss? Well, thank you. Okay. Our thanks to the lecturers. You know, again. We're very happy to have two new men in our circle of acquaintances, and we hope that we'll see you again here, or maybe we'll see you at your respective places. And good to see our old friend Chuck.
Thank you.
Again. Thank you so much for being here, and Godspeed to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See, I'll send all